Democracy is out today. Tom, good morning. In your book, you write about America's embrace of illiberalism, writing this, quote, "These assaults on democratic norms, as we will see, are coming from populations whose anger is rooted far more in notional injustices and imagined dangers than in actual harms. The dissatisfied, illiberal citizens of the early 21st century are not the armies of unemployed men marching on Washington during the Great Depression because their families were on the verge of starving. They are not the disenfranchised African Americans of the 1950s seeking to attend school without being murdered. Instead, the threat to democracy now in America and elsewhere comes from the working and middle classes, the people among whom I was born and raised, whose rage comes overwhelmingly from cultural insecurity, inflated expectations, tribal partisan alliances, obsessions about ethnicity and identity, blunted ambition, and a childlike understanding of the limits of government. Why are people who are already free and who are by any relative measure materially and politically better off than those in more repressive states attacking their own systems of government? The answers are as disturbing as they are counterintuitive. We are losing because we won. We are suffering because we are successful. We are unhappy because we have what we want, Joe.
Tom, you and I were members of the same party, a party that over the past 40 years wallowed in victimhood. We certainly see a lot of victimhood from the woke people on the far left. But I think you and I have both said it. The right has wallowed in victimhood for decades, and everything was an attack against us, whether it was from Washington or Hollywood or you know, fill in the blanks. But you talk about working class and middle class. What I'm finding, and other friends of mine are finding, is even people who are extremely successful, who have advanced degrees, who are attorneys, you can engage in a conversation with them, and then and they're brilliant. And then you get them talking about politics, Trump, or COVID, or democracy, Western democracy. And their IQ plummets like 50 points, and they start rattling off conspiracy theories from websites out of China or some other nether region.
You know, Joe, I wish I could just blame it on the internet putting it all on steroids, and the internet and social media and, you know, all the things that Willie and Mike were just talking about, for example. Those are all serious problems. But if you really look at where all this begins, it begins about 40 or 50 years ago, sometime in the early 70s. And the underlying condition for all of this is the real pandemic, which is narcissism, which has been going on for 40 or 50 years now. And that's where this sense of grievance and victimhood and entitlement comes from. And as I say in the book, none of this is to deny there are real problems in America. There are people who are really, there are always people in a capitalist economy, in a big, vibrant, dynamic economy that are need taken care of, that are going to be suffering. But what's really remarkable about this is that even reasonably well-off people think of themselves as victims. And the key point is that they think it's because democracy has failed. It's not because of any one bad policy or any one politician or policy that they hate. They say this whole system has completely failed me because it didn't give me what I want.
Yeah, but, you know, Tom, the lie that we've told ourselves, and you talk about starting in the 1970s, is we're always in decline. There's somebody, I remember a teacher in 1975, 1976 saying we're going the way of the Roman Empire. If you look at the past 10, 15 years. And, you know, about a year or two ago, I've said this before, because I'm a dork. I said, I want to see what the GDP is of the United States and other countries over the past 60 years. Every country up and down, up and down. Doesn't matter whether Republicans in office and Democrats in office. America's GDP just keeps skyrocketing. These people that talk about things being worse than ever before hold in their hands computer processing that would have had to fill like a city block. You would have had to have a city block of buildings 10 stories high, with supercomputers jammed in there, just through the processing that everybody carries in their hands. We did a vaccine in a year's time that people thought would take 5, 6, 7, 10 years if we ever got it at all. We don't like to say this, but in many ways, these are the best of times, and yet we're just looking down this rabbit hole and trying to find, doesn't matter, again, who's in office, the worst conspiracy theories to talk about how the end is near for the United States of America. It just isn't.
You know, Joe, this show has made my bad takes about music legendary and a national thing. But in the book, I actually have a whole section on decline rock. That, you know, because we live now and we always say, well, this is the worst time ever. And I said, look, you know, if that's true, then it was the worst time ever in 1975. And then again in 1985. If you look at the popular culture, the messages from, you know, I talk about Bruce Springsteen. I mean, Bruce Springsteen talks about his town dying, you know, 3 different times in 30 years. You know, the Brits had rock about how, you know, England was completely on the ropes and dead, you know, 35 years ago. It's something we do to ourselves because we want to believe that somehow things are not our fault, that it's just that things are so terrible and we would do better and we wouldn't have to be so angry if things just weren't so awful all the time. And you know, every age has its advantages and disadvantages. But this notion that somehow in 2021, when we're living longer, healthier, the world is mostly at peace, whether people want to believe that or not, it's true. You know, people want to believe that this is just the worst time ever. And it's a poisonous nostalgia that keeps looking back for a better year. And there's no way a democratic government anywhere can keep up with that kind of constant nostalgia unless it can invent a time machine.
Willie has a question, Tom.
So, Tom, how do you balance this argument, which is really well made in the book, and people should go check it out, with the reality that, you know, for a lot of people who supported Donald Trump, they saw something that they thought maybe they could turn around their lives, which is to say, you don't want to diminish what a lot of people are going through in this country. A lot of people who have seen their towns disintegrate, who have seen their jobs go away, and who don't know what's around the bend. Those are real concerns not to be dismissed just because they supported a candidate who you may not like. So how do you balance those two things?
Well, first, I should say, I grew up in a town like that. And I write about that in the book. I do not come from a privileged family. My parents were Depression-era high school dropouts. I grew up among factories that by the time I was a child were already empty and rotting. I played in abandoned, with abandoned equipment and empty factories and coal yards and railroad trestles. And I write about that this morning in USA Today. But, you know, there are two things about that. One is a lot of that happened before people are willing to admit that it happened. I have a friend that I talk about in the book who says, I remember when all these factories were full. And I point out to him, I said, look, that memory is literally impossible. We broke the windows in that factory when we were 11, like 50 years ago. People have convinced themselves that there was once this golden age that they remember that was taken away from them only in the last few years. The other is that, yeah, these are real problems and these are real dislocations, but that doesn't mean that the constitutional system of democracy, of universal human rights, of tolerance and secular government that has somehow failed us. Bad policy is not the same thing as a complete failure of democracy. And I think a lot of those propaganda sites and a lot of very opportunistic politicians, many on the right and more than a few on the left, unfortunately, and across the world, by the way, and this is not an American problem solely, have convinced people that the only answer is to blow up the system and to put people like themselves in charge to tell the rest of us that democracy is over and that we need to live in an